Hello and welcome back to Everyday Writers, your one-stop shop for demystifying the writing process. We're here to be your helpful guides on your journey to becoming a published author. I am one of your hosts, Crystal McQueen.
And I'm your other host, Jordan S. Keller. Thank you for joining us on this episode, our top 10 frequently asked questions about writing. In 2017, I started a writing group, and Crystal joined soon after, and over the years, we've been asked a lot of the same questions about the craft from a lot of fresh writers, and we've compiled this list. So to start it off, the top 10 questions asked at our writing group. Crystal, what are the best ways to write your first draft?
We've kind of talked about this before, but the best way to write your first draft is to actually get it on the page. Whether you abandon it or move on to another story, just putting words on the page is what's going to be really helpful. If you're a plotter, then getting words on the page for the outline is going to help. And if you're a pantser, just being able to put words on the page is going to help right from the get-go. Number 2, Jordan, how do you start and keep a writing routine?
So the key word there is to start. And there might be a lot of false starts as you're figuring out what works best for you. I have a separate writing playlist I have to put on. I have to write mostly in the morning. Sometimes at night is helpful for me. And then I need to make sure I do a sprint timer. So I can't look at anything but my computer screen for 15 minutes. And then once I'm done, I can do something else. Usually I don't want to do something else. But I know some people who sit in the same position, who light the same scented candle, who have to have the certain TV on a channel or have to have a certain playlist playing. So just starting is that key and trying to figure out what works best for you.
Yep, I put on the same kind of comfy pants. Yeah. I get a blanket, I sit in the same spot, and the drink really helps for me. So making sure I have hot coffee while I'm writing is really important.
By the end of a writing sprint, I will have like 9 empty bottles of Monster Energy and water and Mountain Dew.
Oh my gosh.
It's awful. It's so awful. Oh, but our third question, Crystal, how do you prepare your draft and what kind of research are you doing?
When I am writing, I'm always thinking about different aspects that I want to be authentic or world building that I need to do. I use a lot of different research tools. I'll either read books that are relevant to the genre. So like when I wrote Casey's story, I read several books about coronal mass ejections, which are the sunspots that hit the earth and create like the aurora borealis and cause all of the different electromagnetic issues. So books are really helpful. We talked about Copilot, so you can use that. Just make sure that you fact check. You'd be surprised how many people are just willing to answer your questions. So also when I was writing Casey's story, I emailed the head of astronomy at Thomas More University and basically went through all of my theories and like, would this happen? And he wrote me a very long email back. And he was like, if you want to get lunch sometime, I'll talk to you about this. So you'd be surprised how many people are just willing to talk about something that they're passionate about. Don't discount universities and experts. They're really willing to answer your questions. So Jordan, one thing that a lot of writers face in our fourth frequently asked question is how to overcome writer's block. So have you ever experienced writer's block and how do you get past that?
So if anyone says they've never experienced it, I feel like they're lying to you because it could just be a lack of motivation, not knowing where the story's going, unsure of how a character is going to react to something, and it just kind of stops you in your tracks. But for me, when that happens, it's not going to keep me from writing. I'll shift focus, I'll write something silly in a new world with a new character just to refresh and kind of get my mind off the problem. And usually that'll let me work through it more organically. And when I come back to the original project that I was blocked on, I know exactly what I'm doing now. So just writing something silly or writing in your world that you're stuck in, but from a different character's perspective, from a different place in the world. Maybe you're jumping ahead several chapters in the manuscript. Or just doing like writing prompts for a week, just short, like 500 word, write about a flower in a windstorm, and just remove yourself from what you're considering a problem. And then when you come back to it, you have a fresh take on it. That's what helped me with writer's block. For our fifth question, it's all about developing your unique voice. So Crystal, how did you manage that with your stories?
Sometimes it's really easy depending on the story, and sometimes it's a lot harder. With the first story that I wrote, it was very easy for me to slip into Casey's voice. I was very attuned to what was going on. I felt like I related to her. I felt like I really understood what motivated her. Now, when I wrote A Pops the Sun, that voice was a lot harder for me to capture. I ended up having to rewrite the first chapter about 6 or 7 times. I wrote it from different points of view. I wrote it from different tenses. I wrote it from different locations in the story. One time it was in a coffee shop, another time it was in her office, another time it was in a subway. And so each time I was trying to say, like, what is this person? Like, who is she? Sometimes she sounded very childish. Sometimes she sounded a little too mature. Sometimes she seemed a little distant. And so it took me several tries before I finally slipped in and was like, yes, this is who she is. She's, confident and a little bit abrasive and very sad. And so that voice was a lot easier to hold on to. But instead of waiting for a train with the wrong coffee in distant third person, it is now first person close narrative, and it starts with her in the basement of a university doing a test. And so it's completely shifted where the book goes. So trying to develop that unique voice, sometimes it's really easy and sometimes you've got to work at it a little bit.
As someone who's read both of those first chapters you were describing, the voice that you came with Ellie at the actual first chapter you have now is so realistic. I felt like I was sitting with her in that basement the entire way through.
That is so nice. Thank you so much. Especially because I've really struggled with that book and trying to make it be what I want it to be. So I appreciate that. So, Jordan, as somebody who is still editing that book, for our 6th question, what are strategies you can use to edit your first draft? Like, what do you do when you're editing that first one?
There's a lot of things you can do to edit that first draft, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of the things that I've tried just so it's that first-hand experience for you, and that way I can let you know exactly what worked and didn't work. So the one thing that I've heard a lot is just completely rewriting your first draft. So you've written it, and now you're just going to read your chapter, remember what you like, and then rewrite it entirely. I hated this method, but I will not say it didn't work. I went line by line and rewrote chapters and chapters and chapters because you're not going to rewrite a bad line. And when you're going this level into it, you know exactly what's happening next. So you're able to put in that foreshadowing right then and there. And by now, you know where you're ending, you know what your characters are. So at a line by line level, it's very easy to incorporate everything. The exact opposite of that method is to shelve your draft for a month and then come back to it with fresh eyes, reread it, and then I like marking everything up by hand. So I'll take a red pen and I don't like this line, we need to incorporate this, and then make a list to the side, like, did so-and-so really say this in chapter 4? And that way you can fact check yourself as you're reading. And then the final way I've been editing my drafts, and I use this more later on, so like draft 2 or draft 3, I'll let Microsoft Word read it aloud to me, and I'll just sit back and listen. And it's really easy to know if you've used a homophone wrong, if your dialogue sounds really clunky, if you're restating the same information, if you've mentioned paragraph 1 that they walk into a bar, and then paragraph 3 they walk into a bar again, then you know, like, okay, well, they can't walk into it twice.
See, those are really, really great examples of ways to edit a first draft. And I think that that's amazing because so often I'll look at my first draft and just be overwhelmed. So that's really, really cool. I'm definitely going to use probably all 3 of those. I think that if you combine all 3, having it read to you, shelving it, and rewriting your first draft, I feel like you just can't go wrong.
And especially taking that step back allows you to get less upset with comments you're going to give yourself, which kind of leads into our next question number 7. How do you handle feedback, both the good, the bad, and the ugly suggestions you'll get from early readers?
The first thing to remember with any and all feedback is it's done in a place of love. Like, somebody's not giving you feedback to correct you or to show you that they're smarter than you. Writing is such a personal endeavor that when you get feedback, you have to remember to be appreciative, even if you don't agree with it. Thank you very much for your opinion. Thank you very much for what you're giving me. So often we'll see different things in all of the writing groups that we've been in where somebody will immediately shut feedback down and argue with it, tell you why that feedback is wrong. The problem with arguing with feedback is that that person is not going to be willing to give you feedback in the future. The more that you argue with feedback, the less that people are willing to be honest with you. When you're trying to get constructive feedback, you really are trying to make your book better. So the things that I do when I'm getting feedback is, first, I take a Word document and put all of the feedback in there under my own name. So it doesn't matter who gave it to me, I will just put what the feedback is and highlight it. And then I'll shelve that chapter or that section for a while. And when I come back, I can't remember who said what, so I'm not attributing it to the emotion. I'm not attributing it to whether or not that person has any foundation for what feedback that they gave. And it really helps to distance yourself. And then you can decide, okay, do I really want to take this feedback? Because if you take too much feedback, have you ever seen those memes on Facebook where it's a pizza with a chicken on it and M&Ms? And
Yes.
I can't remember what the third thing is, but it's like, if you incorporate all your feedback, this is the kind of pizza you get.
Mm-hmm.
Remembering that when you get feedback, not all of it's going to be good, not all of it's going to be great, but it is really helpful and generous for people to give that feedback to you. So always be appreciative, even if you don't use it.
Our group has the rule of three, right? If two people say something, it's probably a preference. If three or more people say the same feedback, it's something you might want to consider.
And that is another thing, is like when you're getting feedback, differentiating between a person's preference and what actually is going to make your story better. That is something that you really want to take into account. So another area that we get a lot of questions about is actually our number 8, which is how do you create believable characters? And Jordan, you do a lot of sci-fi, you do a lot of fantasy, and so creating otherworldly characters, how do you do it?
This is my favorite part of the writing process, and I'm going to sound so crazy. But for a reader to believe your character is real, you have to believe they're real. So, like, I talk to my main characters in the car, I give them interviews, I'm always like, I wonder what Abigail would do in this situation. And I'm constantly putting myself into their shoes in daily mundane situations to get down into, like, who are they at their core? And you can do this a lot of ways that are less crazy than talking to them in the car.
I don't think it's crazy at all. I think this is amazing.
Thank goodness. There's a lot of like character interviews, character bios that you can find online and fill out. I think those are very helpful. Getting your basic facts and then getting into like, what does your character dream about? What are their fears? What was their childhood like? What are their future goals? And just to really understand who they are. And you can also do like character webs, which I'm starting with my current first date project. Like you have your central character and you have a bunch of lines leading to all the other characters. So like Rory is secretly in love with Twyla, and Twyla only likes him as a friend. And so like you can kind of just easily glance like these relationships because those make them true characters as well.
I love this because I feel like it's the journalist in you coming out, where it's like, I need to know more about these people so that I can write about them. When I'm writing, I find out who the person is by like, well, that was snarky. I kind of like that about you.
Yep. A good exercise, if you're not quite sure how to write a character, is you can do the fan fiction trick, where you're just going to take a character you already know the ins and out of, whether they're a book character, a movie character, someone from a TV show, and just write a day in the life as them. And you'll kind of start developing ways like, oh, they do see the world like this, or like, oh, they would do this because of this reason here. And those will let you know what to incorporate into your own characters. That's sort of a cheat sheet that you can use. This is not me saying steal characters, you need to create your own, but that's a good way to practice it. The last thing you can do to make your characters feel believable is always keep in mind what their wants are. So every character at their core wants something. They want something short term that they can achieve relatively soon, and something long term that they might not get to even by the end of the book. But these will drive your characters, and knowing what they want really helps them be believable because then they are always in pursuit of something. They're never stagnant in your story.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And also remembering that not only do they want stuff, but they need certain things, even if they don't realize they need it. So keeping those in mind, I think, can keep your story moving.
So when people talk about stories and novels, they're usually talking about character-driven and plot-driven, which leads us to our 9th question, which is, Crystal, how do you write without letting the plot drive your whole story?
This is actually something that I was given a pretty strong critique in on the first novel that I wrote. Things were conveniently happening because I needed them to happen for my character to get to the next step. Like, yes, somebody could meet 2 random strangers in a gas station, but it doesn't mean that it feels natural. So, for example, one of the things that I wrote in my first novel is that Casey has this obscene idea that she's going to go and hunt because she's starving with this bow and arrow that her kid had from 5th grade. I went into all this backstory as to why these arrows were here. So she goes out, and not only can she not shoot them, but obviously they're kids' arrows, so they're not going to penetrate anything, definitely not a deer's hide. It was this whole thing where I needed her to be outside at this time when the people came so that she didn't get caught. And so I created this whole like side thing to get her out of the house. And while I thought it was interesting. It didn't feel natural. You can't have somebody that's freezing cold and hungry go into a barn and find food and fire there because you need them to survive. You're just basically magically making things appear to make their life easier or to keep them going. And that's the plot leading the story rather than the story leading the plot.
Sort of the yes, but rule. Yes, your character achieved the goal, but at what cost?
Yes. So we are down to our last question. So Jordan, since you have 3 books now out with a 4th on the way, tell us how you know when your manuscript is ready for submission. How do you know when you're ready to send it to that agent?
So I knew when Wildfire, The Rise of a Hero was ready when I was sick of looking at it. Like, at this point, I had spent years with the idea of the character and a full year with the manuscript. And once I was comfortable with letting someone read it without me feeling the need to hover over their shoulder and be like, well, that happens because of this, and I'm going to fix that later. And did you like what that happened? Once I felt confident enough to give it to my mom and then not need to explain anything in it, that's when I knew I could give it to my agent. But you also need to make sure that your manuscript is as polished as possible. We're all at different levels with our editing skills, and that's totally fine. But you need to make sure that you've at least had a proofreader look through it. Maybe that is running it through Grammarly or running it through Pro Writing Aid or putting it in a Word document and making sure you're checking all those red underlines. Maybe it's letting a friend read it and they can point out, oh, you're missing a word here, or this part didn't make sense to me. Because those first couple of pages are going to be your first introduction to the agent, and if they're not as polished and crisp as possible, unfortunately, they're not going to want to work with you most likely. So making sure it's as polished as possible. And you will get more time later to edit it again if need be. So,
if need be, absolutely need be.
You're right, absolutely. I think Wildfire went through almost 4 rounds of editing after I got the agent, after I got the publishing deal with it. So it never ends, but once you feel confident enough that you don't need to explain it, I think that's a good indicator that you're ready.
Yeah. I do think that that's also important to remember, or I guess it's not part of our top 10 frequently asked questions, but it's something most people don't realize, is that once you actually get it to your agent, the agent might want edits, and you'll need to make those. And then you get it to your actual publisher, and they might want edits, and they want developmental edits, line edits, and so if you think you're going to turn it in and be done and it's going to be polished, it's not.
The first time you write the end, congratulations, you finished the book, now the hard part begins.
Yeah. Did they tell you when you got Wildfire what edits they wanted you to make? Did they tell you, like, I want this, but I want to change these 5 or 6 things?
Not the publishing company I went with. Before I got my agent, I reached out to a hybrid, like, press and agent people, and they were super fun to work with, but they wanted me to amp the spiciness up in the book.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah. And so we discussed that before I signed the contract, which was a great thing, because ultimately I didn't want to take the book in that direction.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode of Everyday Writers. Thank you for letting us be part of your writing journey. And remember,
write with the end in mind. Even if you don't have that full outline, a roadmap or a general daydream of your story will work.
Be mindful of accepting too much or not enough feedback. Keep your story yours. But if multiple people have the same feedback, maybe take a second look.
And lastly, polish up that manuscript, but don't fall into the trap of perfection over progress. You're honestly never done writing that book. Join us next time for the common writing rules and when to ignore them, where we're going to talk about passive voice, filler words, dialogue tags, and more. If you have a question that we missed, please let us know on our Facebook page, Everyday Writers, and we'll see you next time.
And don't forget, every day is a good day to write.